Faurisson was a professor of French literature at Yale University. He published a few private pamphlets denying the existence of gas chambers. He was then suspended from teaching on the grounds that he could not be protected from violence. He was then, at that point, he was then brought to trial for falsification of history. The book that you're referring to is entitled Memoir in Defense Against Those Who Accuse Me of Falsification of History on the Matter of Gas Chambers. It was, in fact, I didn't know of its existence, but it was submitted to the tribunal, basically, the court for which he was tried for falsification of history and later condemned. Now, how did I get involved in this? Well, at some stage along the line, I was asked to sign a civil rights petition, as I do thousands of times, as I do for Salman Rushdie, which no doubt enrages the Ayatollah Khomeini.
Which is a different question.
It's not a different
price put on his head by
yeah, but here's a case where a price wasn't put on his head, he was actually punished. There's lots of differences. In my view, see, in my view, I do believe in freedom of speech. I realize that's not a popular position around here, but I believe in it.
I share that position,
okay,
so don't be afraid.
Just as I defended people like, say, Henry Kissinger and Walt Rostow when they came back, although I despise what they stand for, when they came back, when Walt Rostow, a real war criminal in my view, when he came back to try to get a position back at MIT in 1969, I was in fact the spokesman for a group of students, radical students, who said that if he is being denied this position on political grounds, we're going to protest and demonstrate about it, because we think this war criminal has a right to teach.
Would you have quit?
Pardon?
Would you have quit?
If he had been turned down on political grounds, I might have, because I don't believe that people should be turned down on political grounds. But my point is, that's a really controversial position, incidentally. The war was going on. We were talking about a man who was a war criminal and was going to continue research, which is be using. Now, let's go back to Faurisson.
I'm going to bridge it. So you was for his right to free speech.
I signed there's a very, first of all, there's a very clear academic freedom issue, very clear. A man is prevented from teaching French literature because he wrote a pamphlet about gas chambers. That is outrageous. It couldn't have happened in the United States, I should say. He was then brought to trial for falsification of history, which is even more outrageous. He was actually condemned, which is even worse. I signed a petition calling on the tribunal to defend his civil rights. I was one of 500 signers. At that point, the French press, which apparently has no conception of freedom of speech, concluded that since I had called for his civil rights, I was therefore defending his theses. I was then, which is absurd, of course. Anyone who knows anything about civil rights knows that you're typically defending freedom of speech for views you detest. There's no other point to do it. Now, let me go on. Can I continue with the facts?
Yes, you can continue with the facts for hours, but I mean, there are a few facts that,
Let's get to the so-called preface. I was then asked by the person who organized the petition to write a statement on freedom of speech, just banal comments about freedom of speech, pointing out the difference between defending a person's right to express his views and defending the views expressed. So I did that. I wrote a rather banal statement called Some Elementary Remarks on Freedom of Expression, and I told him, do what you like with it. At that point, Faurisson was writing his memoir in defense, unknown to me, and my statement was added as an avis, as an opinion. It was attached to this statement in which he defended himself.
Which wasn't asked from you before?
No, but in fact, see, I can't really. I told him, do what you like with it. I mean, I didn't know about the book, but actually, I think it was completely, like, for example, if Henry Kissinger was brought to trial for for falsification of history, I would have no objection to having something I wrote on freedom of speech attached to a memoir in which he defends himself in the charge. Of course, freedom of speech issues.
I won't ask you, that's the difference.
Well, okay, but I'm saying, but, you know, I mean, freedom of speech issues are important. Crucial, in fact, some of the most crucial issues. So when I learned, now those are the facts. Now you know, in my view, this is a banal and trivial issue.
There's one simple question. Didn't you ask yourself afterwards whether it was very wise of you, on your part, to act at least like you were defending him and the person instead of the right of free speech?
No, because I never acted that way.
No,
I never defended him as a person. I don't even know.
In fact, I made it to infer it.
Oh, that's true. You see, people who don't, I realized as soon as I signed the petition that this is going to be interpreted by people who have not yet reached the Enlightenment. We're still in the Middle Ages. It's going to be interpreted as a defense of his views. Of course I realize that. I understand the world. But freedom of speech issues are important, and I'm perfectly willing to face
But then
that.
why did you try at the last moment to get it back from
That's
the
the
book?
one thing I'm sorry about.
But that's
one
the real, that's the
No,
real
it's
important
not.
thing.
It's
of
not.
course,
You mean the fact that I tried to retract
because
it?
with that you said it was wrong of you.
No, I
to do
didn't.
it.
See, in fact, take a look at what I wrote a letter, which was then publicized, in which I said, look, things have reached the point where the French intellectual community simply is incapable of understanding the issues. At this point, it's just going to confuse matters even more if my comments on freedom of speech happen to be attached to this book, which I didn't know existed. So just to clarify things, you better separate them. Now, in retrospect, I think I probably shouldn't have done that. I should have just said, fine, then let it appear, because it ought to appear. But that's, apart from that, I regard this as not only trivial, but as compared with other positions I've taken on freedom of speech, invisible. This doesn't begin to compare with defending the rights of American war criminals to do their work while that work is being used to murder and destroy. And it doesn't begin to compare with dozens of other cases.
One
where I've
last
defended
question.
freedom
When
of
you, I mean, on this subject, when you like to stick to facts, which I in itself find very realistic, why didn't it occur to you that maybe his facts were wrong? To put
Of
it
course
very
the facts
mildly?
were wrong.
I mean,
but
but then you
irrelevant.
Then you
Freedom
could
of
have
speech
signed any other petition that you wanted.
I can't even understand this question. Why didn't it occur to me that maybe his views are wrong? Of course it occurred.
Well,
I knew it. You know, if you want to read what I said.
But that was the reason that you finally tried to
No,
retract
the
it.
reason I retracted it was quite different. It was that I realized at some point the French intellectuals cannot make the distinction.
Who cares?
Between,
Who cares?
well, I agree, and that's why I say I shouldn't have even retracted. Everything, that's the, as I said, that's the one thing that I regret.
You regret your regret.
Well, I regret the fact that I tried to accommodate to the medieval character of French intellectual life. And I should have not done that. I should have simply said, look, if you can't understand it, that's your problem. And now, that's a very difficult position to make in Europe. I should say that an issue like this is almost inconceivable in the United States. In fact, there are examples very similar to Faurisson. There's a professor of engineering at Northwestern University, major university, who writes books denying that the Holocaust took place. I mean, if he were deprived of the right to teach and brought to trial for falsification of history, the country, there'd be a huge uproar over the country, because there's a commitment to freedom of speech, and that means freedom of speech for views that you detest. That's the only time when the issue arises. Now, if a person can fail to distinguish between defending rights and defending the theses expressed, they have to go back to the Middle Ages and start all over again.